Okay, welcome everyone to this month's Infinitive Live webinar. My name is Michael McCormick. I am a market development executive with Infinitive. This month's topic is manage risk through controls automation. So before we jump in, just a few logistics. As with all Infinitive Live presentations and webinars, we will be recording this and making the recording available at our website, infinitive.com. We'll also be emailing the link out to everyone who registered. So please feel free to pass it along to others in your organization who couldn't join us this afternoon. The Q&A function is enabled, so you can submit your questions. They'll only be seen by our panelists, and we'll try to answer a few if we have time at the end of our presentation. For any we don't get time to answer, we are going to do an updated blog on controls automation, so we'll be sure to include that Q&A in that blog, and we'll be sending that out by email as well. And lastly, we'll sprinkle in a few poll questions as we go. In fact, here is our first one to start us right off the bat. Are you currently driving automation efforts in your organization? It's a yes, no. We're going to start with an easy one. So a lot of yeses, more than 70%. So that's great. So hopefully we'll cover a lot of great topics for you. And for those who haven't started yet, definitely have a lot of great information for you to get started. So, okay. So why are we talking about control automation today? I think a great case study that was published by ISACA recently, a Midwest regional bank undertook an automation effort within their IT change management control inventory and was able to consolidate 15 manual controls into one automated control, increase coverage of control testing from 9% of their application inventory to 100%, and reduce the employee effort of testing those controls by 70%. And then lastly, they estimated that about 60% of their current control inventory could be similarly automated. So some really compelling stats there from that case study as to why we're talking about control automation today. So our agenda, the benefits of control automation, getting your automation program started. We're going to talk about some control automation use cases and examples. And then finally, some critical success factors so that you have a great control automation program in your organization. So let me introduce my colleagues. First, Dave Rudolph. Dave is a client service executive at Infinitive in our risk management practice, has over 15 years of experience helping various companies and industries transform their risk programs. And Laura Moy, a director in our transformation practice, also over 15 years of experience in IT transformation programs, risk mitigation, and especially data privacy. So welcome, Dave. Welcome, Laura.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. So kicking off today, Dave, what do we mean by control automation?
Thanks, Laura. So I think before we dive into controls automation, it probably helps to define what we mean by a control. And in the context of ITGRC, which for those who are unfamiliar with that acronym, ITGRC is information technology, governance, risk, and compliance. And a control in this context is it's really a specific measure or mechanism that's put in place to mitigate a risk. Controls ensure compliance with applicable laws, regulations, standards, both internal and external. Controls can be technical, administrative, physical, but the common denominator is that they're designed and implemented to address risks. So when we're talking about controls automation, really what we're talking about is automating a control activity. It's the process of automating some activity that may be manual in nature. And automation provides a number of potential benefits, which we're going to cover in this webinar. But among them include improved security, improved monitoring and visibility, process efficiencies, and ideally lower costs.
Got it. So for the context of our webinar today, what do we mean when we say a control is fully automated?
Well, for the purpose of our conversation today, we're going to consider a control fully automated if it doesn't require human intervention or decision making to achieve its objective. So here are 3 criteria. So no human intervention to operate, automated monitoring, reporting, and alerting based on some specific rule set, and automated decisioning based on a specific rule set. So for example, configuration settings can be used to enforce a control. And an example I often use is password policies, right? So password policies can be enforced through configurations. In the case of a password policy, you don't update your password, you may get a reminder, or you may get many of them. Reports can be generated that show who's approaching the password deadline and who's out of compliance. And then, finally, if you don't update your password within applicable timeframes, you're going to be locked out of the system. So that's one example, kind of an easy example I'd like to use for automated controls.
Yes, I've definitely never personally run afoul of that control. So control automation touches on a lot of business drivers for organizational leadership. What are some of the key drivers as you see them?
Well, again, process efficiencies, cost savings, reduce risk, enhanced testing coverage. Automated controls don't require population sampling, so if you have an automated control, your control testing should be a little easier. And enhanced compliance is another benefit, and also improved developer experience. The more automated your controls are, the less that your DevOps teams or your dev teams are going to have to focus on compliance, and they can turn their attention instead to feature development and those sorts of things. So improved developer experience is a big one.
So let's take a pause for another polling question. Which of these areas do you hope to see the biggest benefit utilizing control automation? So you can check all that might apply to you. Process efficiencies is the leader in the pack with reduced risk, a close second. So very interesting. Last is improved developer experience. So I know we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So
very interesting. So how does automated control actually make it more effective?
Well, it removes human judgment. So let me give you another example. Say a business, an organization let's say it doesn't have a commercial solution for, say, email security. And that would include things like filtering spam, scanning and removing malicious attachments, that sort of thing. If that solution is absent, then they're really putting their faith in their employees to determine what's safe and what's not. And that's not always a great choice. I can only speak for myself here, but I'm 100% certain that I'm not perfect. I sometimes make mistakes. Don't tell my wife I said that, but setting that aside, right? My humanness extends into my working life, and I may be 99.99% secure in all my tasks throughout the year, but it's that one day, right? The 1 hour out of a day where I'm distracted, I click on a malicious link, and then, boom, I've potentially given away the farm. So automated controls can be more secure. They can take the human element out of it. In that case, having a solution for email security would do just that.
Right. So Dave, let's talk about some of the top issues that automated controls can really impact. One that comes to mind are data breaches, for example. I think it was back in 2017 when Equifax had their massive data breach, exposed the personal information of over 147 million people. Now, that breach was caused by a vulnerability in the company's web application framework, and they eventually had to pay a settlement of $575 million to the U.S. government. So, and according to a 2022 digital risk report by Valor Cybersecurity, AI and automation controls reduce data breach costs by up to 80%. So because these tools help reduce one of the most significant factors of a data breach, which is time, their use has the greatest positive impact.
Yeah, and that's like a really great, really expensive example. But Dave, what are some other areas you would recommend our audience focus on and why?
Let me get to that in a second. I just want to click down on the Equifax example and just put out there that data breaches, major IT outages, ransomware attacks, these are top risk issues for businesses. In fact, I think they were listed as like the top 3 risk issues for businesses in 2022. So clearly they deserve some attention. Another thing I want to call out here is I saw a statistic recently that said 38% of the cost of a data breach actually comes from lost business. So that's customer turnover, lost revenue from customer turnover, subsequent costs for acquiring new business. It's all of the stuff that happens after these major events. So it's a big deal, right? And we want to make sure that we have controls in place to mitigate these risks. So getting back to your question, Laura, which is where should businesses focus? I'd say there are a number of them, but I would put testing at the top of that list. So that would include static application security testing, dynamic application security testing, software composition analysis. All of these testing types can be integrated into a CI/CD pipeline. They can improve testing coverage, evidencing, lead to faster deployments, all sorts of benefits. Significant reductions in risk during application development, right? Other areas I would look at is automating data, so automating data backups and recovery, and then monitoring and alerting are other areas that deserve a lot of attention. So automated controls can operate continuously, so that can make it easier for an organization to detect and prevent a risk from occurring. There are these automated control solutions, they will operate 24/7. And for any organization that's interested in enhancing their monitoring capabilities, I would encourage them to look into security incident event management systems, extended detection and response systems, security orchestration and automated response systems. There's some phenomenal products out there that can be used to help implement additional automation and reduce risk.
Got it. So what I'm hearing is that effective control automation execution gets you ahead. So you're spending less time on compliance while actually being more compliant. And you're also saving development time and energy, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So controls automation, it alleviates manual effort that's placed on dev teams who are otherwise having to perform highly manual processes. Which at the end of the day, for those dev teams, it introduces a lot of burden. But automation, it reduces the amount of time that they have to spend on compliance activities. And it increases the amount of time they have to drive innovation and do things like feature development, that sort of thing. So, automation helps ensure that through standardization that you'll be more compliant with internal and external requirements, regulatory or otherwise, and that you'll have more visibility into what's happening within your organization from a risk and compliance standpoint.
So the reasons to invest in automated controls can be pretty compelling, especially when you start to think about the other, more value-added activities that people can be spending their time on. So Laura, for those who want to start a controls automation program, what are some key areas to consider to get going?
Well, all programs come with trade-offs, and really establishing up front where you want to invest time and resources is really essential in planning your initial scope. Do you want to tackle areas of highest risk, areas of technical synergy, or even areas that are the most manual? because you can't do everything all at once. So you really need to determine before you start what is going to be most impactful to your organization's risk reduction. So for example, I supported a program that was regulatory compliance focused that was, highly manual, thousands of reoccurring cases, hundreds of thousands of data points, and it has a 0 failure rate to date, perfect audit results, and no issues. On the flip side, I have seen an automated control implementation totally take down a critical business system, and it was, immediately yanked out of production. So while these are both extreme examples, I really hope it reinforces that manual controls doesn't always mean bad, and automated doesn't always mean good.
Yeah, so Laura, if manual controls can be good and automated controls can be less good, then how do we know we have the right controls and the right number of controls for that matter?
Yeah, so organizations should limit the number of controls in their ecosystem. Identify where controls can be consolidated, where there's redundancy, where you can pair controls even to have preventative and detective controls working together to reduce your risk posture. And additionally, you should really evaluate or establish processes and frameworks that enable quick adaptation to change, because the only thing that's really guaranteed is that things are going to change.
Okay, well, with so much change, where should your focus be?
You need to focus on the basics, which is admittedly easier said than done. You need to identify the strategic drivers and business objectives for your organization and align to them. Because ultimately ITGRC is a business enabler. So if you can't make a clear argument for why investing in automation is the right thing to do, then you're really going to have trouble selling the business value. Additionally, you're really going to need buy-in across your organization. And the onus is really on you to connect the dots for each stakeholder to get their buy-in up front. Everyone always has their own business segment specific priorities, and part of your automation journey is to build the relationships and support across your organization to get them to prioritize automation efforts. Executive sponsorship is also really key. You need champions who have bought in. They identify the need for ITGRC. They're going to understand the challenges that you're up against, and they are really willing and, even more importantly, actively providing support.
So Laura, that can be a big ask. How have you approached this in the past on some of your previous engagements?
Yeah, really identifying and defining the program's governance and engagement models up front. I found it really helpful to, establish a committee or a group that represents business, technology, and compliance interests. Because as much as you need leadership buy-in, you really also need that support body of folks that have diverse skill backgrounds, diverse viewpoints, and interests to move the work forward. So while there's a lot to be said for stop talking and start doing, this is not an undertaking that can work effectively in a bubble. Additionally, you're going to have to go in understanding that there will be trade-offs with the priorities amongst this group, and that's really key. So know where you can flex and what your non-negotiables are, prior to establishing and working with these folks will really make it a much smoother process.
So Laura, if an ITGRC baseline doesn't yet exist, you'll need to create one?
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely some key questions you need to answer, not ask, before starting any kind of control automation effort. What are your desired outcome? What is the business case? What are the requirements? What are the risks? How are you controlling for risk today? What controls do you currently have? Who owns them? How are they being executed? What type of controls are they? Manual, hybrid, automated? And are you seeing any themes with any of them? For example, are there any controls that are failing routinely? And if so, why? You really need to identify the data and the framework to track success upfront. Because if you don't have like a clear, really detailed picture of where you need to go, you're going to waste a lot of time and resources jumping into implementation. All
right, let's take a pause for another polling question. what are your biggest barriers to automation in your organization? Lack of time, budget unavailable, no buy-in across the enterprise, poor executive support. There's probably a few more, but so the biggest reasons are budget unavailable and lack of time. And what's good is that poor executive support is the least chosen answer. So that's great because that is important, as we just mentioned. So a lot of those who, what, why, where, when questions would come under the scope of a well-managed GRC program. Those basics need to be firmed up before we apply any technology to automate the controls that have been implemented. So Dave, what should organizations do before they embark on the how of an automation program?
Well, Michael, I think you just said it. There's some questions and some basics that need to be firmed up. So a well-managed GRC program is going to help answer those questions, and it's going to facilitate the identification of control automation opportunities. So for example, as part of a well-managed GRC program, your organization should be conducting regular risk and control assessments, which will account for threats and vulnerabilities in your environment and so forth. The point of these assessments is obviously to ensure risks are accounted for and addressed in line with an organization's objectives and risk appetite. But a key component of addressing risk includes managing control throughout its life cycle. So that's asking things like, how is the control designed? How is it being executed? And at what frequency? How is it evidenced? How is it monitored? And really, in summary, it's looking at what are we doing today and asking ourselves, can we do it better? And to understand if you can be performing control activity better, you can use standard frameworks and approaches to pressure test where control may have weaknesses and where automation may be able to help you. One of my favorite ways of pressure testing a control is putting it through an FMEA process.
So Dave, for those in attendance who aren't familiar with FMEA, can you describe it a bit?
Sure, that would be helpful, wouldn't it? FMEA stands for failure mode and effects analysis, and it's a structured way to identify and address potential problems or failures before they occur. So an FMEA is a great way to identify dependencies between services and processes and applications, and supporting infrastructure. And identifying those dependencies is critical in understanding where potential failures could occur, and failures that could be mitigated through, say, additional controls. By extension, maybe some additional automation. I do want to say, though, that there seem to be solutions out there for everything, and the feasibility of implementing certain solutions is sort of outside of the scope of an FMEA, and that would include implementing automated solutions. So for organizations that are looking to identify best areas to automate, I would say FMEA can help you get started, but you're still going to need to perform that feasibility assessment. You're still going to need to do a cost-benefit analysis. Automation is great, but it can also be very expensive. So you really want to make sure that the risks you're reducing through automation warrant the expenditure, and it could be a really fine balance.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of a great example you and I were just talking about the other day, where the FMEA framework was able to help identify an issue before it became a problem, and that was emergency account termination.
Yes, yeah, that is a great example. And that emergency terminations are, by their nature, very high risk. There are areas where automation can significantly reduce that risk, right? Because if somebody is terminated immediately, you want to make sure that all of their access is terminated with them being walked out of the building or what have you. And it's also an area that's potentially expensive. So hence, the feasibility assessment, the cost benefit analysis that's required to identify if automation is an appropriate solution. In the emergency termination process, where again, let's say someone's being actively walked out of a building, you want to ensure that all the person's access to production and business systems is immediately terminated. And you're doing that to course, preserve the security of the business and reduce risk. But answering, how do we do that is, it can be a tough question to answer, particularly when organizations have so many disparate systems, from HR systems to code hosting platforms like GitHub to SaaS applications that this person may have access to. So it's a security challenge, but technically speaking, it's also an integration challenge, and it's a challenge that can be addressed through automation.
So you both talked a lot about processes and frameworks, but what are some examples of technology that support some of these control automation efforts?
Automation can come in many forms, and there's different sort of levels of automation. But I'll start with some commercial software solutions that provide control automation capabilities that enable compliance. So some, AWS, for example, provides Amazon Guard Duty, AWS Audit Manager. Google has security products, Google Cloud Platform Security, for example. There are programming languages and frameworks that can be used to write scripts that can facilitate automation. Those include PowerShell, Python, JavaScript. And then there are workflow tools where I've seen a number of workflow tools get implemented to, or integrated with scripts, for example, to help facilitate automation. Jira is a very popular tool that I've seen integrated into some workflow solutions. Can also be used for IT GRC processes. ServiceNow is another one we see everywhere. It's a cloud-based platform. They do have an IT GRC module, which provides tools for helping to automate controls and manage risk and ensure compliance, and that sort of thing. So there are a number of commercial solutions available, and there are a number of programming languages. Just depends current state.
Dave, I see you have Datadog there. What are your thoughts on continuous monitoring and observability tools like Datadog and their usefulness in the IT GRC space?
Yeah, continuous monitoring applications are very important tools for IT GRC, as they enable organizations to detect and respond to potential threats in near real time. And observability kind of takes that to the next level. Observability solutions like Datadog are phenomenal at tracking compliance in near real time. For those who are unfamiliar with the observability concept, we had a webinar last month about it. I urge you all to look it up on our website. But observability is it's really the ability to monitor and understand the internal state of a system by analyzing the data generated from various inputs. So while controls automation and observability are kind of distinct concepts, they're often used together in modern IT operations, and they complement each other well. Both controls automation and observability can serve as really kind of critical components of a modern IT operational kind of security shop. And working together, they can ensure that your systems are managed efficiently and securely and with minimal downtime. So, again, observability platforms like Datadog will give you really fine-grained, granular access to data that you'd need to identify where there are issues in your environment.
Yeah, and I think we can all agree that having tools in place to monitor and proactively attend to an event before it happens is really a win.
Absolutely.
Yep. So now that we've established a firm understanding of how to get started, let's talk about where Infinitive has helped some of our clients execute control automation programs. So I'd like to break the conversation into 3 areas: some good use cases for automation, some bad use cases for automation, and that middle gray area where you might want to proceed with caution. So to start with, Dave, what are some good areas for automation?
Some good areas for automation. Well, generally speaking, you want to introduce automation in areas of highest risk and highest toil. I would say that the best areas to automate are areas that have clearly defined business rules, include tedious and repetitive work, are time sensitive. Tasks or activities are time sensitive in nature. They're tasks that can be error prone, and I find that automation is really helpful when you're looking at data from across multiple systems, right? So bringing all of that together. Common areas where we see automation include identity and access management. So there are some automated solutions for authentication, authorization, for example. Cybersecurity, you have security incident event management systems, you have extended detection response systems, you have security orchestration and automated response systems, and all of which help with incident detection response. We talked about the SDLC as well. Again, testing, automation, and integration are superb, and for any team that's doing DevOps, agile work using a CI/CD pipeline. And then there's network security monitoring tools and their configuration controls. They can be part of your network management environment, so firewalls and that sort of thing. All great areas to automate network, SDLC, cyber, IAM.
So these areas are a great example of, ripe for automation. But what, in your experience, are the process areas that don't lend themselves to automation?
Yeah, not all controls can or should be automated. Manual controls, for example, are appropriate for low volume work. They're appropriate for work that requires human judgment. I like to say, exceptional or unique circumstances drive exceptions. So, think, for example, of an exceptions management process. We see these at organizations all the time. So you would need an exceptions management process if, for example, there's an asset, an application system, what have you, that can't conform to an internal requirement, but needs to keep running in production. In that case, human judgment's required. There needs to be a discussion. And here automation can help with a workflow, but it doesn't substitute, for human judgment decisioning. You still need to have somebody weigh in. And then certifications. I mean, you can automate a workflow to facilitate a certification process, but an appropriate review and sign-off needs to happen by a human. So think, for example, about financial reporting. If an executive at your organization is responsible for reviewing and certifying financial reports, they better be doing it. And automation can help with the workflow, but you can't automate a signature.
Yeah, and you don't want to automate yourself into a jail cell.
Yes, yeah, that's true. And actually, just to kind of apologize for the tangent here, but a little history lesson to that point, Laura. In 2002, following several high-profile accounting scandals, the federal government passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX, which, at the risk of totally oversimplifying, basically says that corporate CEOs need to personally guarantee through a certification that their financial statements are accurate, and failing to do so or lying about it could put them in jail. Could put the CEO or the CFO or whoever is providing that certification in jail if they're lying about it. So can you automate a certification? Well, no, you can't have a bot sign off on the accuracy of your financial statements. You still need a human to do that. You still need the CEO or CFO to do that, but you can ease the workflow for the certification process through automation.
Yep. So there are also a few areas we have run into with our clients that are good examples of not to automate.
Yes. Yeah. So some examples there would be things like physical security controls. If you have a high value physical asset that needs to be protected, right? You're still going to want security guards. You're still going to need access control systems. You're still going to need locks on doors. There's going to be video surveillance that needs to be monitored and managed by trained personnel. So automation can't replace all your physical security controls. It's just not happening. In the change management process, change validations are generally required, and having an SME come in after a change has been deployed to production, but having an SME come in and sign off that the change was successfully implemented, that's a necessary step and not something that you want to automate. Again, you can automate the workflow, but you need somebody to attest or certify that the change was successful. So in each of these cases, you're not going to be able to automate everything.
Yeah, and really reinforcing that here again, manual controls are not always bad, but you should still be looking at, there are probably portions that are automatable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important that manual processes and their associated requirements are clear. And while you may not be able to automate every action and every control activity, you can use automation to distribute work. You can do that through ticketing, and you can do that through alerting, and various other means.
So Dave, we talked about some good use cases, some not so good use cases. What about some of those gray areas?
Well, generally speaking, fully automating controls is always going to be a challenge. It really depends on your organization's infrastructure, its current state. As we alluded to earlier, automation is very beneficial in areas where processes are standardized and inputs and outputs and responses are clearly defined. Automation isn't as useful in novel circumstances. So that's circumstances where an organization is confronted with, say, a situation it hasn't seen before. So think like a black swan event, for example. In those instances, automated controls can again help orchestrate responses, but organizations will still really need to depend on security analysts and engineers and others to identify the best next steps to take based on the data and information that's available around that novel situation. And there are tools for that. There are tools for seemingly everything, but I think it should go without saying that generally fully centralized automation with 24/7 continuous monitoring over everything is hard, period. So one example, imagine if you were working in a highly distributed computing environment that for whatever reason doesn't have a centralized password management function. Setting up a function to enforce password requirements is going to likely require standing up a central authentication server and then connecting everyone's device to it. And that's an integration challenge. So there's technical complexity, right? But that's just one example. Highly distributed environments that include a mix of different cloud services and deployments are challenging. SaaS products, for example, can sometimes be difficult to centrally manage. So they require administration locally, but setting that aside, the bottom line is you will never be able to replace people. So you're never going to be able to fully automate everything, and that's controls included.
Right. So Dave, you talked about some ways to automate, such as building scripts and leveraging workflow solutions from some common tools. And you talked about the different use cases that would both lend to automation and those not so much. And Laurie, you gave us some things to consider before even deciding to pursue automation. So if we think we're ready to go and move forward with an automation program, what are the critical success factors in your experience?
Well, there are several key points that you should have a clear idea of before even embarking on these types of programs. Control automation must be aligned with the overall GRC strategy of the organization. This includes like risk tolerance, regulatory and internal requirements, and really the overall goals and objectives of your organization. And really what I mean by a clear definition of scope and objectives is like what process and controls are being automated, what goals are being pursued, and what are the most important. What outcomes are you expecting from this effort? So before you start, you need to know the details regarding where you want to go rather than just like more automated. And this will really help ensure that your automation program is aligned with the overall goals and resource planning of your organization. So for example, 75% of organizations acknowledge that siloed technology systems pose a significant risk management challenge, but only 35% take enterprise level action to address that issue. So, you're here now, you're thinking about standing up an automation program, or, you're already on that journey. And while it's super challenging, you're way ahead of the game.
Okay, so you nailed down your scope and approach. Are you ready to go?
No, not yet. You also need to ensure that your organization really has effective risk management. So this really goes back to what I said earlier of having a cross-functional support team. Effective risk management is really critical to the success of your control automation efforts. It really helps ensure that risks are properly identified, assessed, and addressed. I've probably said it 100 times already, but you really should not automate a process that is not currently at peak effectiveness. Automating a control doesn't inherently make it better. So again, I realize I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but many organizations have controls, and they have compensating controls. You need to make sure that the control and the process supporting that is sound before even really talking about automation. Also, effective control automation requires really careful planning and prep. Thorough risk assessments, determining what data is needed and how it's going to be collected, and really developing a comprehensive testing plan. The global amount of new data captured, created, and replicated annually is actually predicted to grow 435% by 2025. So you really need to ensure that you're planning for that, and you have to be doing that now. Also, control automation requires significant budget and resources. So it's really important to allocate appropriate resource and funding to ensure its success. I will say I've seen over and over and over again that getting the resources and budget, and our poll sort of reflected the same thing. It's so often reactionary to a critical event or a critical failure. And I would personally love to see organizations prioritize these efforts, before there's a problem. But, we see automation isn't always as exciting as new innovation, which actually reminds me of something my dad always said, when I was growing up. I'm going to paraphrase slightly because he was in the Navy, but it really only takes one "oh shoot" to wipe out 1,000 attaboys. So it really doesn't matter if you have the coolest bleeding edge technology if your customers can't trust you. Resources have to be dedicated from risk, technology, and program management specialties to support these efforts. This work cannot be done in a silo.
So Laura, what does that robust process design look like?
Well, the processes that are being automated, before you put pen to code, should be really well designed and efficient, with really clear instructions and guidelines for how to perform each step. Again, do not automate bad processes. You have to ensure that the control or the control processes are sound before even approaching automation. Additionally, we see a lot that technology used for control automation needs to be properly configured and integrated with existing systems and processes, and it must be able to capture and process data accurately. So if you're paying for tools, you have these tools. Evaluate how they can best support your organization, and make sure they're running effectively. So if you're using Datadog, are you using it to its full potential for observability? You really need to make sure that all of that is in place.
And Laura, where does data privacy come in?
So data privacy and security in general are really critical concerns. Cybersecurity is a boardroom agenda item, with 88% of folks agreeing that it is a business risk. And even more shockingly, 51% having experienced a critical issue in the last 2 years. So it's really important to ensure that all data collected and processed as part of your control automation program is stored and processed securely. Data privacy is a really quickly growing topic of concern for every organization. There's new state regulations that are always evolving. GDPR in the EU has been in place for a while. So it's really making it even more critical to have strict, robust controls in these areas, because you don't want to end up in the news like Sephora did.
Yes, Sephora, one of the first companies to pay a fine for a CCPA violation. So,
Yep.
All right, so how do you keep these programs going and sustainable?
Well, the success of control automation is really highly dependent on user acceptance. So it is important to provide adequate training and support to help users understand and effectively use the new systems and processes. Your automation program is going to succeed or fail based on the relationships that you build across your organization throughout planning and rollout. There's going to be people in areas of your organization that are going to be a hard sell on this. You really need to start there. And I totally know someone just came to mind. Additionally, ongoing monitoring and continuous improvement are essential for ensuring the effectiveness and efficiency of your control automation program. This includes monitoring the performance of automated controls and, really making changes and improvements as needed. So upfront, you need to know what the plan is once you reach your automation nirvana and how you intend to continue and to grow and evolve from there. What are the plans? What are the teams and the processes that you need to have in place to maintain and evolve this effort? Because really the worst thing in my mind that you can do is to make the shift towards automation and just walk away like, we're done, we're automated. You're just going to be back to square one in like 3 to 5 years.
Right. All right, let's try to squeeze in one more polling question. If you could wave a magic wand to get help, where do you most need it? Engineering technical support, IT GRC risk management support, program startup support, or process support? Engineering and technical support has a slight edge over process support. So that's good. That's interesting. Okay. So we're just about out of time. I want to thank you both so much, Laura and Dave, for sharing your experiences. If I could list my top 3 takeaways, I think they'd be, number one, this is a program of work and really should be treated as such. So agree on your objectives, get senior management buy-in on the business case, allocate the right resources, plan the work, work the plan. Secondly, we talk about automating controls, but we're really automating processes. So make sure those process designs meet the requirements and test its effectiveness. And then lastly, organizations' technology landscape is evolving faster than ever, and is only going to get faster. So you need to build long-term sustainable approach to implement new processes and systems into your environment with automated controls built in from day one. So great. We do have time for a couple of questions before we wrap up. And so let me see what we have here. Are there any government regulations that impact control automation programs? Dave, why don't you take a stab at that one?
Okay. There are plenty of them. I would say, kind of looking into the future, I would watch the artificial intelligence, machine learning space. There's a lot that's been happening recently from a federal standpoint. In 2020, the federal government passed the National AI Act, which mandated that basically a AI ML framework be developed to help organizations design and deploy AI systems and reduce risk. The intent is really to reduce risk in those deployments and in those systems. In January of this year, that framework and a AI risk management framework playbook were actually released to help facilitate the implementation of AI and ML-driven systems. And also, one more thing is, I believe in October of last year, there was a AI Bill of Rights blueprint that was put out by OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy within the White House. And basically, what it called for is 5 common sense protections for AI, to include data privacy, which we've been talking about. A notice for when an automated system is being used to process information, a dedicated human alternative. So basically a manual backup should a problem occur with the AI system. And there were a couple other, I think 2 other points that were brought up, but those were the ones that caught my eye. So I would definitely be monitoring the AI ML space for controls automation, as both AI and ML are going to be major components in automated governance in the future.
Yep, got it. All right, good. Let's see, here's another one. Data privacy. What should I keep in mind when automating data privacy controls? Laura, since you love data privacy, why don't you take a crack at that?
I do, I really do. There are many parts of a data privacy program that could definitely be automated, but I really can't stress enough that it needs to be done with really like the utmost care. This is an area that, you know, can and has landed some really big name organizations in the news for literally like all the wrong reasons. While the US is ramping up their privacy legislation state by state, and there is, you know, some rumblings of, you know, federal regulations as well, GDPR has actually been in place in the EU for a while now. And GDPR, for example, requires that individuals provide explicit consent for their personal data to be processed by automated systems. So obviously something that, you know, when you're talking about automated controls is super important. I was just reading, just this month, ISO actually put out new privacy by design standards, which is really super interesting. Michael and Dave have heard this all the time, but I really feel like this is an area that is picking up speed. And data privacy today is sort of what cybersecurity was 15 years ago. So it's just going to be something that stays around, and it's going to be something that really shapes your organizations. So we could have a whole webinar on this topic, but I mean, to really directly answer your question, yes, you should automate to reduce risk, but you need to be, you know, really careful and really on point with these types of controls, just due to the, you know, really high profile regulations attached to it, and the enforcement that's really gaining traction right now.
Great, great. We're going to try to sneak in just one more question because we are just about out of time, but I think this is a short one. Is FMEA a published framework, and where can the process be found? Dave, you want to?
Yeah, so it comes from Six Sigma. There's plenty out there about it. I would Google it. I would say it's the first place to probably start. There's loads of information available on how to apply that framework.
Great.
I would go to Six Sigma. That's a good website. It has a bunch on the FMEA.
Yep, great. So there's a bunch more questions. We are not going to be able to get to them, but as I mentioned before, we are going to answer every question in our updated controls automation blog. We will be sending that out, a link to that, along with a link to the webinar recording for you guys to share with your colleagues at work. So I want to thank Laura Moy and Dave Rudolph again for their time and expertise today. I thought it was a great discussion. I hope all of our listeners have what they need to inject a little bit of life into their own automated controls program. So once again, thank you all for your attention. Have a great rest of the afternoon.